fraudsters are not stupid. They
Quite the
are
contrary.
they are extremely intelligent. Some of the stuff I catch, it's almost I just got to take my hats off and say, "Wow, that was very intelligent how you came up with that." But we're gonna stop you. So it's this really interesting thing. They understand the IP address and user agent solutions, so they get past that, and it's super easy for them to do that. So what they do is they use a more sophisticated level, which is going to be your advanced bots, malware, human fraud farms, click farms. They're going to use those tools to get past that because, again, programmatic's the largest marketing channel. There's billions of dollars a year spent on it, which means there's billions of dollars in opportunity. This is why last year, $125 billion was stolen from marketers last year alone.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Super excited to have Rich Kahn on today's podcast to talk about sort of the evolution of ad fraud and invalid traffic and invalid impressions and that entire ecosystem, because it's continues to be an issue depending on who you ask. It's either a de minimis issue that people bake in, or it's actually a pretty big issue that continues to need significant remediation. But let's start with the origin story, Rich. What was the catalyst for you to start Anura?
Let's see. Okay, so I had another marketing company, and I think we did the business together. We did it going back decades ago. In fact, I know we were at a trade show together. That was one of the areas that we guys met. But so in 2003, we started a ad network, small ad network. Started driving traffic, hiring publishers, building platforms, building an ad network back in the day. And started noticing some anomalies about the data of the visitors that were flowing through from our publishers to our advertisers. And I knew what it was. It was fraud. I had fought fraud earlier. I think some of the earlier bouts of fraud that I had date back to the late 90s. But anyway, so I knew it was fraud. I'm like, I don't want to be the guy solving fraud. I just want to go find a solution, pay for it, bolt it on, and go about my business. Because, running an ad network is a full-time job. And we were growing it. We were up to like 50 people. It got to a point where we had 50 people in the company. And but again, you want to focus on one task. So did research. And in 2004, leading into 2005, I absolutely could not find a single fraud solution in the marketplace. In fact, later on, hindsight's 2020, I found out that the first commercially available fraud solution didn't come out until I think it was 2008, if I remember correctly. So as a developer, I decided I'll write it myself. So I wrote some software, put it together, and then realized that obviously it's not a set and forget scenario. Fraud keeps evolving, so I kept evolving it. Then 10 years later, I kind of looked up and realized, wow, there's a market for this. So before taking it and building it into a separate product, I went ahead and said, you know what, let me take a couple $100,000 of my own money, invest in test buys, because I'm not going to ask a client to do it. So I will go out and buy traffic, run 3 independent tests, looking at a variety of statistics to see, do we bring something, does our solution bring something new to the market? If it doesn't, why bother? But it turns out we had a much more accurate solution, decided to put it together. And in 2017, we launched Anura as a standalone fraud solution that's licensable.
Cool. That's quite the journey. And did you continue to run the ad network, or did that sort of we were sort of doing them at the same time?
So yeah, we were running them at the same time, and literally we just shut the ad network down last year. Got to a point where it just didn't make sense to continue running. So we got 20 years out of it. Can't complain. But it's like anything else. It led me to building a fraud solution and giving me the data. Because really, when you build a fraud solution, everyone's like, people talk about. So I've talked to some clients like, oh, I'm going to build it in-house. I'm like, you have no idea what you're undertaking. Like, you need a team of people that are going to dedicate their full-time job to doing this, paying attention to fraud, because we're rolling out changes every week, sometimes twice a week. That's how often fraud's changing. And you have to have a team that's dedicated to this. You have to have the storage facilities, the machine learning built, the understanding of how this all works to build a solid fraud solution. So in our scenario, which is nice for us, It's a lot cheaper to license our technology than it is to try to go out and build your own. But the thing is, you have to have access to all that data. And the more data you have access to, the better it is. Now, that ad network I built was seeing 3 to 5 billion visitors a day. So we had ample amount of data to look at. In fact, we had one of those reports that come from those third parties that say, what percentage of the traffic flows through through this domain. And at one point, I think we were somewhere between 5 and 10% of all internet traffic flowed through our domain, which was phenomenal. Didn't make as much money as you would like to make. I mean, it made good money. I can't complain, but it's when you have that much of the internet flowing through your network, you would hope to think you're making a lot more money, but it just wasn't that model. So yeah, and after 20 years of running the company, we shut it down on the 20th anniversary because at that point it just didn't make sense to continue. So and again, we were really focusing 100% of our effort on Anura.
Cool. So what's fascinated me as I've sort of dug into fraud, I started in paid search, right? So the buyer of the clicks only cared if the click was fraudulent, right? And of course, determining if the click was fraudulent in a display environment, that obviously then means the impression was also fraudulent. But when you're thinking about the click-through rates in display and other forms of programmatic inventory, right? The click-through rate is so low, you end up with 500 times more data if you're looking at display data versus click data, right? So when we were looking at fraud in clicks, invalid clicks, you could run analysis and evaluate some of the data to indicate that there were sources of invalid clicks. And Google tried to do its best in eliminating the invalid clicks. Sometimes it wouldn't catch until later, and they would do reconciliation reports and such. But what was fascinating to me is the just sheer magnitude of the data when you're trying to identify the fraud at the impression level. And then all the different sources of the invalid or fraudulent impression, some of which were not even, it was invalid, but it wasn't overt fraud, right? I mean, there's situations that can occur that generate an invalid impression because some teenager wrote some kind of a scraper because they wanted information, right? And they didn't think about the fact that they shouldn't load ad tags, and so it's loading ad tags, right? That wasn't the publisher trying to defraud anybody, but it was still invalid. It was still fraud as it relates to an advertiser, right? So I'd love to hear your thinking on the different flavors, right, of this fraud or invalid traffic and how it manifests itself differently, within the ecosystem.
Yeah. So first off, the definition of fraud, right? We want to understand that fraud is literally not an intent-based traffic. And I try to explain to people, it's Boolean, right? It's either fraudulent or it's not. There's no in between. There's no grayscale like, well, that might be. No. That doesn't exist. It's Boolean. It's either fraud or not. It's very binary. And what you got to look at is the person that's interacting with that web asset, right? Because it could be anything. It could be an ad tag. It could be search. It could be social. It could be whatever, gaming, whatever. So that person interacting with the web asset is either a bot, malware, or a human fraud farm of some kind. Those are the three basic vehicles that fraud commits it on, or it's a real person with intent, right? That's pretty much what you're looking at. So, and every channel works different. So like Google, Facebook. So Google traffic, search traffic, one of the king places to buy traffic from. Everybody wants to buy traffic from Google. 5 to 10% of their traffic is still fraudulent. Yeah. However, if you go to the Google Display Network, it's 50%. And what you're looking at too is programmatic. I like to talk about programmatic. In fact, we're actually just releasing a Programmatic 101 ad fraud ebook this month because it's such an misunderstood market, yet it's the biggest channel of marketing on the internet. So in order to buy programmatic, you go to a DSP. Every DSP you go to this day, when you bring up the word fraud, they're going to say, oh, we got that covered. We have this company or that company doing a pre-bid scan. So before we even bid on the location, we already know if it's fraudulent or not. And everybody buys that. And it's being the wool being pulled over your shoulder, over your eyes. Because here's what's really happening. This is the under the hood stuff that people don't talk about. So a pre-bid solution has to live in that real-time bidding environment, which is that magic 100 millisecond response time, right? So inside of that, an ad fraud vendor doing a pre-bid scan usually has 10 to 15 milliseconds, sometimes 20 milliseconds to come back and say, yeah, thumbs up or thumbs down before the rest of the RTB process takes place. In doing so, they only have time to look up the IP address, maybe the user agent, maybe the device ID, but you're looking at 2 or 3 data points at most because
Yeah.
it's got to be fast, it's got to be responsive. And that's known and classified as a GIVT filter, so a general invalid traffic filter. And IVT and GIVT, and we'll talk about SIVT in a second here, all comes from the certification process of an ad fraud solution. So a client asked me one time, you guys don't even have standards to follow. I'm like, we do. The MRC, I think it was in 2012 or 13, came up with a set of standards for ad fraud solutions and said, this is a set of standards that we're going to post, in conjunction with the IAB, that this is what you should do if you're going to be a fraud detection solution. And you can get certified that you're following those standards. And there's 2 companies that will do that. It's either the MRC directly will do it, or you can go to the trust and accountability group known as TAG. They'll also do it. And they basically have the same document because the standards are the standards, right? It's just having a different company that's going to vet it out and do the third-party audit. So when you get audited, you have to go through this process, and you have 2 different products that you're going to be tested up against. One is known as GIVT, general invalid traffic. The other is SIVT, sophisticated invalid traffic. And just on a side note, I talk in tangents. We talked about probably this is going to happen, and just it's the way I talk. There are probably about 100 companies out in the marketplace that do some type of fraud detection. There's only 8 that are certified to follow the standards. So if you guys are doing some research and looking for a solution, make sure at minimum they're either MRC accredited or tag certified against fraud if you're going to use them, because at least they're following the basic standards. Anyway, so back to the RTB model. So you have that GIVT filter that works. And most of those companies say, yeah, fraud's not that big of an issue. It picks up 1 to 3% of the traffic that's fraudulent. We don't bid on that, and off we go. So fraudsters know this, and fraudsters are not stupid.
Quite the contrary.
They are extremely intelligent. Some of the stuff I catch, it's almost I just got to take my hats off and say, "Wow, that was very intelligent how you came up with that." But we're gonna stop you. So it's this really interesting thing. They understand the IP address and user agent solutions, so they get past that, and it's super easy for them to do that. So what they do is they use a more sophisticated level, which is going to be your advanced bots, malware, human fraud farms, click farms. They're going to use those tools to get past that because, again, programmatic's the largest marketing channel. There's billions of dollars a year spent on it, which means there's billions of dollars in opportunity. This is why last year, $125 billion was stolen from marketers last year alone, just last year. So anyway, okay, the bidding process takes place, ad gets shown, gets displayed. If you wrap that tag after the whole process is over and scan that tag, on average, you're going to find that 50% of those ads are being showed to fraudulent visitors. 50%. And that's how they're making their money. And yet, the advertiser thinks I'm protected because the DSP told me I'm protected. DSP thinks they're protected because they're running a fraud solution. And yet, all the while, these fraudsters are making billions of dollars and they're happy as can be.
Yeah, what's amazing to me, and I've done a little bit of digging forensically to try to understand more about that. But obviously, the wrapper around the actual ad tag before you fire the client's creative, right? That's the one that's supposed to figure out, is this human? Is this fraud? Is it visible? There's a whole bunch of sort of check boxes, right? And, when you think about the fraudsters and they're trying to say, okay, well, how do I make sure I check off all those check boxes? They're quite creative, right? When it comes, especially on the malware side, when they sort of take over a person's machine, the individual's computer without them knowing it, and they're engaging in browsing behavior without the individual even knowing. The IP address looks good, everything looks good at the header level, everything looks good, and it requires a completely different level of sophistication to determine, well, was the person at the keyboard that did this? Or was it some kind of macro or JavaScript somewhere that was doing this? And I agree with you. You got to sort of tip your hat to the guys and say, wow, that was pretty cool in the way you were evil, right? And
Yeah.
but what's also was fascinating to me is that some of these platforms that are either malware based or whatever, they actually engage in fraudulent behavior against publishers that aren't even their clients, just so that the cookies look real and the user agents look real, right? So they're basically perpetrating the fraud not just on behalf of themselves, but they're spreading it out because they want to make it look human. And
Yeah.
that was just would it just blew my mind.
Yeah. It's amazing what they'll do, because when we talk, I have a definition of fraud and I don't have it off the top of my head right now, but part of it says, um, it's all about making money.
Yeah.
It's either directly or indirectly. So obviously you go in front of an RTB and you're part of the SSP pool and there's a publisher, you run some extra traffic, that's directly making money. An indirect look at that might be Facebook. Facebook doesn't have publishers, right? They don't, but how many of us know that Facebook has fake accounts? We all do. Facebook knows it. They announce it. This is what we're doing to eliminate it. But again, fraudsters are very intelligent. So if you look at that, what they do is they have all these fake accounts that are up and running, that are interacting with content, doing what they're supposed to do so they don't get shut down. They avoid shutdown. And then you come across Fiverr and say, hey, I want to buy 10,000 likes for my new page for $10. Those aren't real people, dude. Those are not real people. So that's their indirect way of making money with the bots and the fraud that they're doing on Facebook.
Right, right. So, the one of the ways I sort of think about the fraud situation, or the way people have sort of described the fraud situation, is, they'll do their best, right, to use vendors like yourselves, and some stuff will slip through. They don't want to have too many false positives. They don't want to penalize publishers if they don't deserve to be published. Everybody wants it to be fair, but a lot of advertisers have got to this point where they're like, well, I just realized that it's like going to this bar and I know they water down my vodka, but otherwise I sort of like it, right? And so I'm willing to put up with it because, or otherwise it's a good ambiance, I can still get drunk off of the vodka. I just have to drink more of it. So they just bake it in and just wash their hands of it. Now, what's your perspective on that mindset of, like, it's just a cost of doing business. I can't solve it. I'm going to give up.
It's that, 80%, 20% rule, right? I'm going to adopt it to this in a little bit of a way where you do 20% of the work to get 80% of the benefit. And you don't want to do the other 80% of the work to get the 20% of the benefit, right?
Right.
So you have certain, and I deal with hundreds of clients, so I can tell you that I come across both styles. I have people that are like, look, if we can just get this on, look, I'm at 40% fraud. I need to get this under 10 or 15%, and I'm happy.
Right.
Then I get the guys that are up, I'm at 2%. I want 1%. Let's get it down to 1%. And then you get them to 1%. No, I want 0.5%. Like, it depends on the efficiency of the whatchamacallit. Because, some people, like, they said, okay, if I'm spending $1 million a month in marketing, so now I got to spend 1.4, but I don't have to deal with it. And they're okay with that, Not too many, but there are a few out there that just don't care because they're too busy doing too many other things that are more important. And that loss to them is almost like, if I have to go now attack that and do that, because they don't realize that there are solutions that can do it for them. And a lot of times we'll get people that come to us organically and they just be like, I didn't realize you ever existed, or there was a need for this. Like, and how long you been building this solution? I'm like, well, it's 19 years we've been building the solution right now. And they don't realize that there's a solution to their problem, and it's not expensive at all. But then you got the people, like I said, who will really micromanage. We're actually probably some of the better players that I see is the agencies. A lot of times the agencies, you have two schools of thought there, right? Again, tangent, but that's me. Two schools of thought there. So you have some agencies who say, hey, my client's not complaining, I'm not going to do anything. And they just let it go. And the client thinks the agency's doing everything he can do, so I don't even know there's a problem. So they just kind of, what's that statement from The Matrix? Ignorance is bliss, right? They just don't know and they just don't care. And they're like, hey, if I want to drive in more sales, I got to spend more money at this rate. Then you got the companies who really like, I've come across a number of agencies, and it's about 50-50, where they're like, look, if I can knock off 5% of the fraud, 10% of the fraud that they're seeing, that increases their ROI. Their ROI goes up. I get a bigger budget. I make more money. This all makes sense. Help me do this. We're actually can't announce it yet, but we're in the process of tying with one of the largest digital marketing agencies on the internet, and we're basically going to cover their entire client base.
Awesome.
They've been doing a test right now on one client, fell in love with the software, been back testing it for the last 3 or 4 months. They're ready to rock and roll across their entire, and they're one of those agencies that cares about getting not micromanaging, but being ultra efficient in every aspect of the funnel for the client. So where they spend their money, where the conversions are coming, making sure the data is clean, making sure there's no fraud involved. Like, they're looking at everything to try to really drill down and eliminate any aspect that could impede the ROI for their client, because they get it. They know that the better their ROI is compared to their competitors, the more they're going to win.
So that a lot of folks I found, including myself sometimes, aren't always familiar with, when a third party like yourselves identifies a certain percentage of fraud within a buy, given that you're sort of this Switzerland organization, right, which sort of doesn't have a horse in the race, you're sort of just saying, listen, this is just the facts. Here's the data. This is the fact. The buy was 45,000 this month, but 5,000 of it was fraud. There needs to be a reconciliation, right? I mean, the agency and the client don't want to pay for the 5,000 of which was fraud. And if there was an exchange or a DSP, the DSP is like, all right, well, I guess I don't want to pay upstream to the exchange, or I don't want to pay upstream to the publisher, right? But yet the mechanisms are not as clean on that, right? For after the fact, when you raise your hand and say, wait a minute, there's a problem here, right? In the 500 milliseconds, all that plumbing is in place, right? For just sort of addressing it within that 500 or 600 millisecond window. But then after the fact, when reports come out, it's not as clean. So how do you guys deal with that sort of, reconciling the money part?
There's actually two things interesting that came from that one question. We'll start with answering the question. We'll start there, right? So essentially, you're dealing with, and you're typically dealing with, okay, Google, Facebook, TikTok, you're dealing with juggernauts in the space, right? They don't like being told how to charge their client. So asking for money back is a waste of your time. Now again, if you're spending a lot of money, so you're a big client, you got a little more pull. But the guy spending, 50 grand, 100 grand a month doesn't stand a chance on getting credit. In fact, Google, I'll give an example. Google actually has a form that you can do. You can look it up on Google, and asking for a refund. There's a form you can fill out with information, send your reports, what data, what you found, what percentage. And I read a bunch of different documents, spoke to a bunch of different clients. I had a client, I give a perfect example, spent 100 grand, spent $1 million, found 100 grand in fraud. So it was a decent client for Google. So he brought it up to their attention, and they literally sent him back a check for 3 cents. 3 cents. Now, on average, what I've read is that Google will agree with about 10% of the claims that come through that form, and they'll pay about 30% of what they're asking for. So when you really do the math, globally, it's 3%. So it's not, the whole idea is to identify it and avoid it. So what our systems do and what we teach our customers is, okay, so fraud is coming through. How do we identify where the fraud's coming from, and how do we eliminate it from continuing to come in? And we have tools and metrics to build up and help that.
Right.
But, more importantly, when fraud comes in, besides paying for it, you have a lot of other costs. So let's say you're an e-commerce site. Somebody comes in, they're fraudulent, they got a stolen credit card, they zip it through, they buy a bunch of products, you ship out the products, and you find out 4 months later that was charged back. You're out product, shipping, processing, all that information, the chargeback fee. I mean, you're out a lot of money. Besides the couple bucks you spend for that click, you're out a lot of other back end fees. So a lot of our clients, what we try to do is we identify it, we set it up so that doesn't happen again, but we want to protect the back end because the back end can be more expensive than the marketing side.
Sure.
Sometimes you have call centers, sometimes you have, lead generation forms that are being filled out. Now you're breaking TCPA compliance because you're calling people who didn't fill out a form. And now you're up for the fastest class action lawsuits that are growing in this country, which is TCPA lawsuits for calling people who didn't fill out your form. I mean, there's so much more in the back end to protect. Marketing is one aspect, but we want to protect the whole thing. That's just
Right.
how we. So here's the other thing that you brought up in that. We talked about false positives in that statement. And I get this a lot. People talk about it because everybody is used to buying software and just expecting it to work and then running and trusting that software to run their business. Perfect example is Excel. Almost every business nowadays uses Excel to track different things. They put all information in, it crunches all this data, spits out a number, and then you make business changing decisions based on that data. Well, when was the last time you checked to make sure Excel was actually adding the columns up right? You don't. You trust it. And you're making business altering decisions based on that data. And that's a society we live in. We live in a society where you buy software, expect it to do its job, and think nothing of it. Well, my space, the ad fraud detection space, is one of those spaces that it's not like that. Okay, we're a SaaS-based solution. SaaS is very sexy to investors. So you've got, like I said, you've got probably 80 to 100 companies out in the marketplace that are just spinning up these new companies, putting this together, putting together a good marketing plan, marketing it. And what ends up happening is based on hundreds, if not, I should probably say thousands of clients testing between us and other solutions, the average fraud solution in the marketplace has a false positive rating of 15%. So if you do the math, 25% on average is what fraudulent activity is across the board. 15% of that is being mismarked by most companies, which means you're losing 3.75% of your visitors if you listen to that fraud solution. So you're making, business changing decisions, but you're losing out because these solutions in the marketplace just aren't accurate. And part of it is that they're not following the standards that are already set in the industry. They're just setting up shop, putting in some bells and whistles, wrapping up a good marketing plan behind it and pushing it out there. So I always tell everyone, pay attention to the details. If you're going to use a fraud solution, number one, make sure that they're MRC accredited or tag certified against fraud. At least they're following the bare minimum requirements. If not, you're about to buy some software that's probably cheap, that's not going to do the job. It's going to screw up your stuff, and it's going to ultimately kill your campaigns or kill your business because of the false positives. And by the way, some of them have as high as 50% false positives. So it gets out of control. That's number one. Number two, test. Don't trust what the person says on the phone. Hey, if you call my company, don't trust us. Trust your own back-end data. So run the software, let it go through, let it mark the visitors as good, bad, percentage, whatever the markings are, and then run through your back end, confirm that data, check for chargebacks, check for real data. If they're leads, call them and confirm that they're real, and then use your human verified data to validate that the software is real before committing any money to it and before you allow that software to dictate what you do with your budget. This way you feel comfortable with what you have.
Right. Yeah, nobody talks about opportunity cost, right? Because if you get a false positive, then that's an opportunity cost. That was in fact a human, but they were mislabeled, and now you can't sell them anything.
Yeah. And that's a big problem. People are trusting these softwares that are out in the marketplace that are they're doing more harm than good, for a variety of reasons. And I talk about that on endless time. But anyway, the whole idea is, if you're going to buy software, make sure it does the job. Verify it yourself. Look at the back end data. If you just buy software and don't pay attention to the data, you're going to hurt your business.
Let's talk a little bit about the walled gardens, right? Now, in the RTB and programmatic space, there are opportunities to sort of plug into supply or be on the demand side and plug in and, either add wrappers, or you sort of have control to some extent around the sort of ad stack that's running, and the ability to intervene if something bad is happening. But a lot of the walled gardens, they're like, here it is, take it or leave it, right? So how do you deal with invalid clicks and fraud within those networks when they're basically a black box, right? You have some targeting levers at your disposal, but other than that, you're supposed to just sort of cross your fingers and hope for the best.
So we run our company this is just something we learned from it. We run our company on a process called EOS, the Entrepreneur's Operating System. Pretty popular. A lot of people know about it.
Right.
And one of their statements is when you're managing people or projects, trust but verify, which is another popular statement. So if they're going to tell you all this stuff and it sounds good, you want to be able to trust them, and this is the company that you want to use, verify. So get your own fraud solution. When the traffic lands on your landing page, scan it. And if you're not happy with them, find somebody else or push them to open up the doors to something else. So a lot of these companies, they don't want you to do this because they're making money on fraud, not purposefully, right? I'm not going to say, Google or Facebook, they're running out trying to make money on fraud. No, not at all. They're all trying to stop fraud. They're all trying to eliminate fraud. But like you said, the walled gardens, they're going to give limitations as to what they're going to allow on their network. And I get it because there's a lot of solutions out in the marketplace. I'll give you a perfect example without mentioning names. There's a solution out in the marketplace for 50 or $100, which, they call themselves a fraud detection solution, and they claim that they're accurate and all this stuff. But here's the funny thing. They've got like, I don't know, a dozen or so levers that you can say, what's my threshold for proxy networks? And you can 0 to 100 and you can scroll that back and forth. And it's like, what's your threshold for this? What's your comfort level with that? So you got, by the time you would mess up with these 15 or 20 different levers, that's not a fraud solution. Now you're playing with some just algorithm that you're doing yourself. They're supposed to be the experts, but they're making you do it. So a client example came in and said, okay, I turned all the levers down to 0%. But I want as much traffic flowing through. And he ran his Google campaign through it and it reported 3% fraud. Okay. Then he turned all the levers up 100%, and 97% of Google's stuff was fraud. He's like, oh my God, Google's 97% fraud. I'm like, did you even just listen to the conversation you just told me? It's not fraud. It's just the levers you're playing with. It's not a true system.
Yeah.
But people buy into that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the other way of thinking about it is, only the person behind the keyboard knows if they're human or not, right? To 100% accuracy. Everybody else just has to give it a score, right? And so to some extent, your team or any other team just at a certain point has to say, well, we're pretty sure it's human, or we're pretty sure it's a bot or some other form of IVT, right? So that comes to your question about, well, comfort level. Like somebody needs to be the expert and decide, well, this is the cutoff point. We're pretty confident in our assessment.
All right. I don't like plugging myself in situations like this, but it's going to be part of this discussion. So I'm going to say it, but I'm going to give you some other information and say, okay, so
Sure.
The average fraud solution in the marketplace, the way they work is on a scoring system, just like you said, right? Yeah. 0 to 100 is typical score. I've seen 0 to 1,000. I've seen 0 to 1 with 6 decimal places. It's all the same.
Doesn't really matter. Yeah.
Right. Let's just call it the average is 0 to 100. And then they'll tell you once it hits 70, I'm just going to use that as a number, it's likely to be real. Because if you read the documentation, which I have, it says it's 70% either confident that it's fraud or 70% likely to be fraud.
Right.
So the mathematician in me says, okay, what about the other 30%? Right. Therein lies false positives. So now what happens is if you call up and say, hey, I'm still getting some fraud, make that 70%, 80%. And then the fourth quarter rolls around. It's like, oh my God, I'm blocking so much traffic. I'll make the 80%, 50%. It's just a number, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that really separates us different. We don't do that. We do good or bad. If we mark it as bad, we are 100% confident it's not real. And based on client feedback, we're 99.999% accurate when marking a visitor as fraud, right? Now, the good is hard to say. I can't say that I'm 100% accurate, that those are all real good people, because if it's a type of fraud that just came out that I'm not catching, I don't know what I'm not catching.
Right.
And if any solution in the marketplace says we're going to catch 100% of the fraud, run for the hills, because they don't know what they're talking about. So you got to look at it that way, right? So and it comes down to testing those solutions, because every solution has different situations, and if you have the ability to adjust their solution, they're no longer in the driver's seat. You are. Right. So when you have false positives, or you're blocking real people, or you're not missing fraud, they're just going to turn around. Oh, you adjusted the rules. That's on you. It's a great business model. but it's not a real fraud solution. And that's why those solutions like that cannot and are not certified.
Right, right. Oh, I didn't realize that that was a typical certification requirement that
It's not a certification requirement,
okay.
but as soon as the requirements build up that, and I forget the exact terminology, but you can't be letting I think it says something in there that says you can't let the user of your software control over how your rules work. Something to that, it's something to that effect. So that kind of knocks out, half of the market, and because half the market thinks that's what people want. People want to have the ability to control things.
So are there any ramifications to sort of increased opacity on the supply side? So obviously you've got on the mobile side, IDFA. So that sort of adds this really opaque layer on anything that's happening on an iPhone. And then you've got third-party cookie deprecation, which of course it's been missing in Safari forever, right? And then you've got Firefox, it's been pretty much missing, and now Chrome, they're in the process of phasing out third-party cookies there, which makes it a little more difficult to at least use that as a signal, right? As far as persistent third-party cookies. But on the flip side, right, you need to continue to be able to use something. Are there ramifications to that increased opacity that you guys have to deal with as a solution?
Well, everything we have to deal with, right? A new version of Safari comes out, we got to deal with it. A new version, a new flavor of browser comes out, we got to deal with it. Because the last thing I want to do is mismark a real person as fraud. Like we have a client that does gaming, and I think they get like 100,000 plus logins a day, and we're protecting that login for them. If a new browser comes out and all of a sudden we start blocking everything on that browser because we don't understand it, all of a sudden their phone starts ringing off the hook. How come I can't play my games? And if their phone rings off the hook, then my phone rings off the hook, and that's not the thing. So again, yeah, we have to deal with all this. So that's why we have changes coming out weekly, because new versions are popping up. As soon as a new version pops up, we get the dev environment, we play with it, we test it, validate it. Then when it goes production, we retest it, validate it, make sure everything works. So there's a lot of testing with what we do, because I mean, last year alone, I think we saved our clients $1.2 billion in fraud based on our analytics. So, I mean, when you start looking at that kind of level, you make a mistake, and by mistake, all of a sudden, oh my God, we just blocked Chrome, by mistake, I mean, that could be death for our company, because our clients are using us in real time in a lot of situations and control their budgets and control who fills out forms, who logs into their systems. And if we go down or we screw up, oh my God, the phone would be off. I mean, it would be incredible. So yes, everything that happens, our guys have to stay on top of. And here's one thing about SaaS, right? You have a SaaS company, DocuSign. I'll just pick on a big company, right? DocuSign. They have the luxury of constantly developing new software, new techniques, new uses, new cases of how their software can be used. And because once they build something, they don't have to go back and build it again. We don't get that luxury, because as soon as we finish building something, it's just a matter of time before another piece of fraud comes out, which is usually a couple days later, and we have to go back and rebuild. So we spend a lot of our time focusing on the core of our technology, which is making sure that we're accurately marking fraud, catching as much of it as possible. And then the leftover time is spent on product, developing new resources, developing new reports and things that people might want and use, building alerts, building whatever it is that they need or want. But again, for us, the main crux of what we do is that core, making sure it's the best we can make it.
So here's the final question is really about since 2024 is probably more the year of AI than 2023 was, because it's really starting to get deployed this year. And that's sort of good news and bad news. The good news from your perspective is you'll have additional horsepower for fraud detection as you use combinations of ML and AI. But on the flip side, the fraudsters are also going to be thinking, ooh, I have a new tool that I can use. So this sort of cat and mouse or chess game goes up a few notches as a result of AI being in the mix. Have you started to see the beginnings of the fraudsters embracing AI to be more sophisticated?
Yeah, I mean, this has been going on for years, so it's nothing new for us. Because again, fraudsters are extremely smart, intelligent. They've been using AI for years, not just because it became the buzzword of 2023, 2024. They've been on it for a while. So we've been already taking our advantage of it. What's interesting for some of our smaller players that are not certified, there's something that's attacking a lot of those systems. And you can go onto the dark web right now and download a product called Fraud-GPT, and it will literally write the bots for you. And you have to know how to implement them, right? And you have to know the inputs and the outputs, but it will literally write smarter bots for you without you having to do the work. So yeah, I mean, and all that's really doing is empowering newer fraudsters to the market that don't know how to write this heavy code, that aren't maybe as intelligent. So now you can get more people at scale that are less intelligent using tools to write the software for them to game and get around these systems. But yeah, that's definitely something that's been on our radar for the last probably 5 or 6 years.
Based on that statement, I guess I would hypothesize that the percentage of fraud would then escalate, right? Because at this point, the barrier to entry to attempting to perpetrate fraud is lower, right?
Yeah.
So you would anticipate that anybody who can spin up any kind of a cloud instance or figure out how to write a piece of malware where they're using an individual's computer as the source of the IP address, et cetera, can be in that business. Now, they may have, it's like spamming, right? I mean, it won't be 100% successful, but you don't need to be 100% successful, right? And so that's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah, we're looking at it now. So there was a report by some other company, and I usually like to give credit to whoever puts it out. Unfortunately, I'm drawing a blank right now. I don't know who did it, but they claim that the average fraudster, ad fraudster, is making about $5 million a year. So when you put a price tag on it like that, where they're making more than you or I, right? They're making big bucks. The only thing that's good is my moral compass points directly north, so I could never get involved with that because it's just, it's stealing, right? They don't define it as stealing, but it's stealing. But yeah, so if you looked at fraud over the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, it's gone from 18 billion to 40 billion to, I think it went to, the next jump was, I think, 80 or 90 billion. 2 years ago it was 100 billion, and then last year was 125 billion. So it's still growing. They're predicting the fraud solution market's supposed to be a $9 billion market cap in the next 3 or 4 years, because the need for this type of service is growing really fast. And it's all I tell people is I want educated people looking at their data. There's sometimes people, like I said, sometimes they just, hey, fraud solution, you can do the job. You're $50, great. Sign me up. I'm good. I'm done. And they're out. And then all of a sudden they start realizing, oh shoot, what the hell's going on in my campaign? Everything's falling apart. Like, they don't get it. So I can't impress it enough for people to test the data. Most companies offer some kind of free trial, put it to the test, human validate it, and then make your decision which company you want to go with. And that's really the best way to do it. I mean, any software, like, I know when you buy software, I buy software, I do the same thing. If it's an investment, I'm going to look at 2 or 3 companies. I'm going to try to get some friend recommendations. But then at the end of the day, nobody cares more about my company than me. Even if a friend recommended it to me, I'm still going to validate it that it's the right solution for me. So I'm going to run it through my myriad of tests and make sure it passes the mustard with me before I invest in a software. Because once I make that decision, I don't want to have to go back in 3 or 4 weeks and try to figure out what broke. Because
Right.
All of a sudden you're making money. All of a sudden you put new software in and stop making money. Something goes wrong. The first question a developer asks is, what's changed? And you got to go back and find out, oh my God, we onboarded 3 different pieces of software. Which one caused the issue? So better do that upfront work versus doing it later after it's already caused problems.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Rich. A lot of really rich information, pun intended, about fraud and fighting fraud. And look forward to staying in touch as the AIs take over both sides of the market, with you guys fighting it and other folks perpetrating it.
Thanks, Kevin, for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.